Chapter 16, Part 1 of Mounted Police Life in Canada. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mounted Police Life in Canada by Captain Burton Dean. Chapter 16, Louis Riel Executed for Treason. I have often wondered whether, if there had been no rebellion in 1885, real estate in the business centre of Calgary would have been selling for $4,000 per foot frontage in the year 1912. I trow not. The subject matter of my sketch, prior to July 1884, had been living in the United States, where he had become naturalized, and where he was earning a living as a school teacher. He was induced to return to Canada by a deputation of prominent men among the French half-breeds of the North Country, with a view to assisting them in obtaining sundry rights from the Dominion government, and the redress of certain grievances which they had or claimed to have. At that time the country had rather fallen short of the expectations which had been raised about it, and settlers generally were far from being in a prosperous condition. The winter of 1882 had been a very hard one. Witness the loss of some 8,000 or 9,000 head of Senator Cochrane's ranch cattle. This was due in part to bad management, it is true, but the historical fact is indisputable. Newcomers felt that the conditions of life in the country were cruel. The winter of 1883 was also hard, and a good many people in the western country began to regret having come. Money was scarce, and, to use a popular expression, the bottom was falling out of the whole thing. I knew a man who had a place about 8 miles out of Regina, who used to make periodical trips to the Pile of Bones Creek with 3 barrels in a wagon to take home water for domestic and stock purposes. With the outbreak of the rebellion in 1885, every farmer who owned or could provide himself with a team of horses and a wagon could hire himself out to the government at $10 per day. Money poured into the country to feed and supply the troops and police. Militia officers and men visited the country on service when otherwise they would never have thought of coming so far west, and the Northwest Territories and their possibilities thus became widely known. In short, the rebellion saved the country which, as an Eastern correspondent wrote to me in 1884, was not what it had been cracked up to be. The climate alone was a factor that compelled very serious consideration. On New Year's Eve, 1884, the thermometer registered 58 degrees below zero. On the following day it stood at 48 degrees below zero, with a wind blowing at the rate of 55 miles an hour. We had a set of instruments at Regina, and used to keep records for the meteorological department. It was the custom on New Year's Day for the gentlemen to call upon the ladies, who remained at home on purpose to receive them, and offered to their visitors whatever refreshment they happened to have in the house, from tea to liqueurs. In this way one had to drink warily, because one was bound to take something in every house one entered, and it sometimes became a problem how to regulate oneself without doing violence to one's own feelings, or of offending the susceptibilities of the hostesses, whose hospitality was always profuse. On this occasion, however, my visits were very short. I could not keep my horses standing in the bitter wind, and a handshake with a Happy New Year wish was as much as could be compressed into each ceremonial. Nor was the weather inclement only in the winter. I find from my diary that on the night of June 20th, 1885, a hard frost cut off potatoes and tomatoes, so that the climate was as uncertain as it was unsparing. All this helped to make the ordinary settler view the half-breed agitation with indifference. He had so many troubles of his own that he did not care whether the half-breeds were given scrip or not. In the north, at Prince Albert, Carleton and Battleford, it was different. The public there viewed with growing apprehension the agitation of the half-breed element, which largely predominated in the population. The prelates and priesthood of the Roman Catholic Church sent warning after warning to the members of the Dominion Cabinet, and the Mounted Police reports which passed through my hands sounded an ever increasing note of alarm as the later months of 1884 and the early months of 1885 rolled on. In the autumn of 1884 Mr. Fred White, Comptroller of the Mounted Police and Sir John Macdonald's chief political agent, came westward and travelled through the Battleford Prince Albert country in company with the Premier's son, Hugh John Macdonald. When he returned from that trip to Regina, he handed me a long telegraphic dispatch to be converted into cipher and sent to the Minister, Sir David Macpherson, who was then taking Sir John Macdonald's part of the administration, the latter having gone to England. As Mr. White was a special emissary, one would have supposed that his communication would have received some attention, but nothing was done. No steps were taken to check the conflagration which was evidently brewing, and on March 26, 1885, the first shot was fired at Duck Lake. Riel was brought to Regina by train and handed over to me on May 23 by Captain George Young of the Winnipeg Field Batteries. In reporting his arrival to the Police Department at Ottawa, I said I intended to allow no visitor to have speech of the prisoner without a permit from the Prime Minister. I religiously held to this regulation of my own making, and it saved me a great deal of trouble. There was a stock answer ready for everyone who applied at the guard room, and all applicants were informed that they might take it as a final reply without pestering me to death. Riel had quite a number of sympathisers in Quebec, and from that province came the funds which provided him with legal assistance at his subsequent trial. Not long after his arrival at the guard room, I was accosted one day in town by a gentleman who said he was the editor of a Quebec newspaper and had come to Regina on purpose to see the prisoner. I replied that if he had taken the precaution of providing himself with Sir John Macdonald's permit, there would be no difficulty in arranging an interview with Riel, and I asked if he had made any arrangements to that end at the Police Department in Ottawa. He said he had not done so. He had not supposed any such course to be necessary. I had to regret then that I was not at liberty to allow him to see Riel. He looked at me with a sort of pitying smile and said, "My dear sir, I think you hardly realise that I have come all this way from Quebec on purpose to see this man." I assured him that I fully appreciated the length of the journey which he had taken, but Louis Riel, who had led 2 rebellions in Western Canada, was a very important prisoner who would unquestionably be tried for his life, and that, until the policy of the Government was made known with regard to allowing him to receive visitors, I was not at liberty to relax the rule which existed. There was nothing more to be said or done, and the unfortunate editor returned to Quebec. It was not until June 21 that the Lieutenant Governor showed me a telegram from Ottawa to the effect that Government do not wish prisoners to be interviewed before arrival of Crown Counsel at Regina. The matter was placed in the discretion of Mr. Christopher Robinson, Q.C., the senior counsel for the Crown, and his were the only permits that I recognised. Riel himself was given to understand from the first that visitors would have no access to him. He then wanted to be given newspapers, but these too were denied to him. He was told that he might have books or magazines or literature of that nature, but nothing respecting the topics of the day. He, of course, wanted to have a spectacular trial, preferably in the East, before the eyes of the whole world, and little dreamt that his case would be disposed of by a stipendiary magistrate, a justice of the peace, and 6 jurors, in a little embryo town like Regina. A letter which he addressed to the Premier summed up his views in its opening sentence. When he had any particular clerical work that he wanted to do, I used to let him use the Commissioner's office. This was a small office opening off mine, which was not otherwise used, as the Commissioner was in the north, and Riel and his escort could sit there without inconveniencing anyone. The following is a copy of a letter he wrote. He made 3 copies of it, one for the Premier, one for the Lieutenant Governor, and one for me.
Jésus, Marie, Joseph, sauvez-nous, intercédez pour nous, priez pour nous. Prison de Regina, 16 juillet 1885. Confidentiel. Au très honorable Sir John A. Macdonald, Premier ministre de la puissance du Canada. Monsieur le Premier ministre, j'implore un procès complet et à la Cour suprême. Je désire me disculper depuis 15 ans. Si vous cédez à mes instances, si vous m'accordez toute la latitude dont j'ai besoin pour me défendre, Dieu me secourant, non seulement je me clairerai, mais la grande responsabilité des troubles du Nord-Ouest en 69-70 et en 85 tombera lourdement sur les honorables messieurs Blake et Mackenzie et sur les journaux leurs principaux organes. Votre politique au sujet du Nord-Ouest se trouvera comme débarrassée des obstacles que ces deux hommes puissants se sont efforcés de vous susciter depuis 69. Mon intérêt n'est pas seulement de me disculper. Je désire me réhabiliter. Si par le soutien de Dieu et la faveur des bonnes gens, il m'est permis de viser aux avantages d'une vraie réhabilitation et d'une indemnité équitable, ce serait pour rentrer dans la politique manitobaine. Je m'en coûte d'abandonner ma patrie, ma mère, mes frères, mes sœurs, mes parents, mes amis. De plus, j'ai à cœur de continuer mon œuvre. J'apprécie le grand talent des hommes qui ont gouverné et qui gouvernent, encore à l'heure qu'il est, Manitoba. Mais il me semble qu'ils ne comprennent pas sa fondation. C'est pour cela que cette province n'est pas à l'aise et que la Confédération s'en sent. La Manitoba profite, mais il me fait penser à ces personnes qui engraissent sans avoir de santé. Il ne lui serait peut-être pas inutile que j'arrivasse un jour à son ministre. Et il me serait particulièrement avantageux à moi d'y arriver pour continuer avec votre gouvernement ce qui a été commencé, il y a 15 ans, par l'acte de Manitoba. J'avais l'honneur de vous dire dans ma communication du 6 courant que l'Irlande, c'est que je pense, pouvait devenir heureuse, et en même temps les seigneurs anglais continuer à avoir leurs revenus comme l'ordinaire. Le principe que j'aurais à proposer pour arriver à ce résultat me paraît clair et simple. Si mon pays natal m'honorait un jour au point de me faire asservir au premier siège de son ministre, je vous soumettrais mes vues. Dans le cas où il vous serait possible de les approuver, je vous les présenterai pour mettre fin aux better terms qui fatiguent la Confédération sans apporter d'amélioration définitive au Manitoba. Vous me procuriez sans doute l'avantage de modifier en mieux ce que je n'aurais pas encore assez mûr dans mes manières de voir. Après les avoir inaugurées dans la jeune province, vous seriez à même d'examiner comment mes idées fonctionneraient. Si elles réussissaient, vous pourriez les généraliser à toute la puissance. De là, Mère Patrie en jugerait elle-même. Et avant trop longtemps peut-être, auriez-vous, vous, la gloire, et moi, le plaisir de les voir appliquées à la situation de l'Irlande par la haute autorité de parlement anglais même. Le principe et les vues dont j'ai l'honneur de vous dire un mot sont en germe dans la Constitution, l'acte du Manitoba. Monsieur le Premier ministre, les meilleures idées ont besoin d'être comprises pour être mises en vogue. Et lors même, la main de Dieu et celle de mes amis me feraient sortir de ma prison pour me porter à la tête du ministère provincial du Manitoba, il me serait encore bien difficile de faire mon chemin s'il n'y avait pas là un gouverneur qui me comprît. Depuis que je suis à Regina, tous mes écrits ont passé par les mains de monsieur le capitaine Dean. Ce noble officier connaît mes façons de penser. Et pour ne pas le gêner, en lui faisant auprès de vous des louanges qui ont passé par son office, je vous disais tout court que ce serait, à mon avis, un honneur pour le Manitoba d'avoir un lieutenant-gouverneur tel que lui, pour l'honorable monsieur Aikens, un successeur d'aussi grand mérite, et pour moi, un guide dont les conseils me seraient si utiles. Mes bienveillants avocats sont arrivés d'avant-hier. J'ai eu la joie d'une entrevue avec eux. Ils vont insister pour que mon procès ait lieu en Bas-Canada et par devant la Cour suprême. Veuillez m'accorder cela à moi. Veuillez céder aux bonnes représentations de mes savants avocats. Lorsqu'on me conduira dans l'Est, si vous consentez bien que j'y sois conduit, arrangement pourrait être pris pour qu'à mon arrivée, 3 avocats conservateurs, un Canadien français, un Irlandais et un Anglais protestant m'offrent leur bon service. Grande serait ma reconnaissance pour un tel honneur. Ma cause serait plaidée au point de vue des intérêts du parti opposé. Monsieur le capitaine pourrait me conduire. Il suivrait tout le procès. Il vous verrait souvent. Ce serait comme naturellement que vous pourriez le nommer lieutenant-gouverneur du Manitoba. Moi, j'aurais le bonheur de m'en retourner à Saint-Vital, goûter la paix qui m'y attend depuis 15 ans. Et vous, que mes vœux ne vous soient pas suspects, vous aurez augmenté de beaucoup le thème de vos récompenses. Si mes bons souhaits peuvent sortir au travers des barreaux de ma petite et sombre cellule, si ma stricte captivité n'empêche pas ma voix de se faire entendre, puissiez-vous un jour occuper le trône vice-royal de la puissance pour le plus grand bien de cette confédération canadienne dont vous êtes l'un des glorieux fondateurs. J'ai l'honneur d'être, avec beaucoup de respect, votre très humble serviteur. S.D. Louis Riel.
A perusal of this letter must to my mind irresistibly convey the idea that the writer was cracked. I do not know of any word in the English language which so aptly fits the occasion. Here was a man on the point of being tried for his life, for crimes committed in the Northwest Territories in the year of grace 1885, blandly making suggestions as to the government of Manitoba and of Ireland, of all places. It has been said that Riel's grandfather was of Irish descent, and that his name was Riley, but I have heard the statement contradicted just as positively as it was made. Be that as it may, it can excite no wonder that Louis Riel was a heavy burden for his legal advisers to carry. These gentlemen had been retained by Riel's sympathizers in the province of Quebec, and sent westward to give the unhappy man as good a run for his life as possible. Appeals had been made on behalf of the French-Canadian race in the province of Quebec, and this dispatch of counsel to defend Riel was one of the results. The names of the gentlemen in question were Mr. Charles Fitzpatrick, now Sir Charles, Chief Justice of Canada, Mr. F. X. Lemieux, and Mr. I. N. Greenshields, all of Quebec Province. With them was associated Mr. (now Honourable Mr. Justice) T. C. Johnstone of the Northwest Territorial Bar. The Quebec gentlemen arrived at Regina on July 15th, and Riel was arraigned on the 20th. There and then began the most momentous trial that had ever taken place in Western Canada. Mr. Osler, in his opening address to the jury, called it "the most serious trial that has ever probably taken place in Canada." At the opening of the court, Mr. Justice Richardson announced that Mr. Henry Lejeune would be the Associate Justice of the Peace. The clerk opened the court, and the prisoner was placed in the dock. In reply to a question by the presiding magistrate, Riel admitted that he had been furnished with a copy of the charge, of the panel of the jurors, and of the list of the witnesses for the prosecution. He was then arraigned. There were, based upon an old statute of Edward III, 6 charges almost identical, and the wording of them was so quaint that it is perhaps permissible to quote the first charge at length, and to point out wherein the other 5 differed from it. The first charge read: that Louis Riel, being subject of Our Lady the Queen, not regarding the duty of his allegiance, nor having the fear of God in his heart, but being moved and seduced by the instigation of the devil as a false traitor against our said Lady the Queen, and wholly withdrawing the allegiance, fidelity, and obedience which every true and faithful subject of our said Lady the Queen should and by right ought to bear towards our said Lady the Queen, in the year aforesaid, together with, on the 26th day of March, divers other traitors to the said Alexander David Stewart unknown, armed and arrayed in a warlike manner, that is to say, with guns, rifles, pistols, bayonets, and other weapons, being then unlawfully, maliciously, and traitorously assembled and gathered together against our said Lady the Queen at the locality known as Duck Lake, in the said Northwest Territories of Canada, and within this realm, and did then maliciously and traitorously attempt and endeavour by force and arms to subvert and destroy the constitution and government of this realm, as by law established, and deprive and depose our said Lady the Queen of and from the style, honour, and kingly name of the imperial crown of this realm, in contempt of our said Lady the Queen and her laws, to the evil example of all others in the like case offending, contrary to the duty of the allegiance of him the said Louis Riel, against the form of the statute in such case made and provided, and against the peace of our said Lady the Queen, her crown and dignity. Charge number 2 read exactly like number 1, except that it charged the offence to have been committed at the locality known as Fish Creek, and the third charge quoted the locality known as Batouche. The first 3 charges averred that Louis Riel was a subject of Our Lady the Queen. Charges 4, 5, and 6 were exact reproductions of 1, 2, and 3, except that they averred that Louis Riel was then living in the Dominion of Canada and under the protection of our Sovereign Lady the Queen. The alternative charges were necessitated by the fact that Louis Riel had, between 1870 and 1885, become a naturalized citizen of the United States. Mr. Fitzpatrick then submitted a plea to the jurisdiction of the court, which, briefly, set forth that the said Hugh Richardson in open court, with a justice of the peace and a jury of 6, has no jurisdiction to try the offences charged in the information. Counsel for the Crown entered a demurrer against the plea, and the prisoner's counsel joined issue upon the demurrer. It was a very pretty quarrel as it stood, but Providence was on the side of the big battalions. The government had provided some legal giants to uphold their end of the stick, to wit, Mr. Christopher Robinson, Q.C., and Mr. B.B. Osler, Q.C., of the Ontario Bar, the then Deputy Minister of Justice, Mr. Burbage, together with a French advocate from Quebec named Mr. T.C. Cassegrain. With these gentlemen was associated a member of the local bar, Mr. D.L., now Honourable Mr. Justice, Scott. I should perhaps note here that Mr. B.B. Osler was a Liberal in politics, and Mr. Robinson a Conservative. The 2 main questions before the court at this stage were these: 1. Had the court, constituted as it then was, authority under the statute of 1880 to try the case? 2. Did not that statute interfere with and entirely override the provisions of Magna Carta? Mr. Fitzpatrick opened the ball. He dived manfully into the recesses of the Magna Carta, and stirred up the dry bones of King John's unruly barons, to show that the statute of 1880, passed by the Dominion under which Louis Riel's court was constituted, was repugnant to the provisions of the Great Charter, which provided that no man shall be arrested, nor imprisoned, nor banished, nor deprived of life, etc., but by the judgment of his peers and the laws of the land. He quoted authorities to show that a trial by jury is understood to mean ex vi termini, a trial by jury of 12 men, impartially selected, who must unanimously concur in the guilt of the accused before a legal conviction can be had. He spoke very ably and at great length, and was followed by Mr. Greenshields, who, in another speech of considerable length, contended that the statute of 1880 was entirely ultra vires of the Dominion Parliament. It was a great treat to hear Mr. Christopher Robinson's reply. He spoke easily and unaffectedly, with an absence of effort that to me was quite remarkable, and in a quiet conversational tone. He took an interest in all the odd little incidents that occurred in court. If there was a window to be opened or shut, he followed with his eyes the entire operation. A man on the opposite side of the table was sketching a head on his blotter, and Mr. Robinson seemed to take the greatest interest in this head, which promised at first to be that of a girl, but afterwards developed some hair on the face, and was possibly intended for a sketch of the prisoner. Be that as it may, Mr. Robinson watched the progress of the drawing, and any other little incident that attracted his attention, all the while dropping some such commonplace platitudes as these: "As regards the larger portion of my learned friend's arguments, which was addressed to the reasonableness or unreasonableness of those different enactments, we decline to follow them into that argument at all. Those laws are Acts of Parliament, passed by British subjects for British subjects. They have existed for years, and until the past few months their validity has never been questioned. As regards their reasonableness or unreasonableness, I would say this also, that we must have regard always to the circumstances and conditions of the country for which the laws are enacted, and it is impossible that everything which my learned friend calls the fundamental principle of the British Constitution can be extended to all parts of the Empire. But if they rely upon that argument, it is a further answer to say that there is no greater fundamental principle of the British Constitution than the supremacy of Parliament. Neither the right of grand jury, nor the petit jury, nor the right of a jury of any kind, is so much a fundamental principle of the British Constitution as the supremacy of Parliament. So that we have this course of legislation. First, we have the Imperial Legislature saying to the Parliament of the Dominion, 'You can make such laws as you think proper for the government of Rupert's Land.' Next, we have the Parliament of the Dominion under that power making laws, and then we have the Imperial Parliament again, in view of the enactment which they have passed, making this enactment valid. For these reasons, it has been thought on the part of the Crown that nothing could be plainer than the course of legislation under which this court is constituted, and from which it derives its jurisdiction." After all the arguments were concluded, Mr. Justice Richardson delivered himself as follows: "Now, if I understand the contention of Mr. Fitzpatrick, it is that this Act of 1880, so far as it relates to the trial of criminal offences such as this, is ultra vires." Mr. Fitzpatrick: "My contention is that the Act of 1880, in so far as it relates to the trial of capital cases, is ultra vires." Mr. Justice Richardson: "Well, as I cannot hold that, I must sustain the demurrer." The discomfited counsel's face was a study. It was certainly the face of the most disgusted man in British North America at that time. It looked around the court room with an expression of wonderment, which seemed to ask, "Is this all the expression of opinion that is due to me? After all my research, after all my eloquence, are my arguments to be turned down by a ruling of less than a dozen words?" I followed his gaze around the court room and failed to see any expression of sympathy on any face there. The prevalent feeling in the North West Territories was this: we have taken our lives in our hands to open up a new country, and in working out our own salvation we do not want to be let and hindered by old-time provincial prejudices. To such an extent did this sentiment prevail that the North West Council, which was then partly appointed and partly elective, had passed an ordinance practically prohibiting the collection from a North West settler of a debt incurred by him in the older provinces. This was, of course, disallowed by the Government in Council, but the feeling was very much alive all the same. The plea to the jurisdiction of the court having been disposed of, Mr. Johnstone was put up to demur to the information on the ground that the first three charges were laid against the prisoner as a British subject, and that the other three were silent as to his nationality. That is to say, that charges 4, 5, and 6 did not allege that the prisoner was the subject of a foreign state at peace with Her Majesty. Mr. Burbage replied: "In 3 counts we have charged him as a British subject, and with having violated his natural allegiance, and in 3 counts we have charged him with having acted contrary to his local allegiance. It is quite sufficient that a man may live in a country to be guilty of treason." The magistrate overruled this demurrer, and the prisoner was called upon to plead, which he did. "I am not guilty." One whole day had been taken up, and the end was not yet so far as preliminaries were concerned. At the opening of the court on the following morning, the prisoner's counsel applied for an adjournment of the trial. They said that 3 witnesses, named Dumont, Dumas, and Nault, who were in Montana, were material to the defence. Mr. Greenshields represented that they would come to court to give evidence on the assurance of counsel that they would be protected. He also said, "It is an undoubted fact, competent of proof, that the accused was confined in the Beaufort Asylum for a period of 3 years, from 1872 to 1875. The defence required certain medical witnesses from Quebec and Toronto to testify to the condition of the prisoner's mind at that time." Mr. Greenshields said, "The court can see the necessity in a trial of this kind, where life is involved, that we should be given the fullest opportunity to make a proper defence. What we want is a fair trial. That is what we are here for, and we should obtain the fullest and fairest trial. And if after a full and fair trial the court and jury find that the prisoner is guilty of the offence charged, we will have done our duty before the court and the people. The people of this country will be satisfied that no injustice has been done. If, after the production of such affidavits as these, the prisoner is forced on to trial on the charge of high treason, public feeling will not be satisfied. A trial of this kind, in which the public are all interested, must be a fair and impartial trial." This was simply playing to the gallery of the Quebec party, which was "agin the government," and Mr. Robinson, when his time came to reply, metaphorically boxed Mr. Greenshields' ears for his insinuations. He said, "I regret extremely that my learned friend Mr. Greenshields should have departed so far from what I regard as professional courtesy and professional etiquette as to make the remarks which he thought it right to make in the discharge of his duty. As to part of his remarks, I understood, and I think everyone else must have understood, that if they meant anything, they certainly meant to imply a threat against those acting for the Crown. That if they declined to accede to the contention, public opinion would be brought to bear upon them, and public opinion would not support them. We are answerable to public opinion, but we are perfectly content to be answerable to public opinion. But I repeat again my surprise that that tone of spirit and sort of address should have been thought necessary in a case of this description." The defence at this time were asking for an adjournment of about a month to enable them to produce necessary witnesses, and had represented that the prisoner was a man of little or no means, and that the necessary witnesses could not be produced without the assistance of the Crown. End of Chapter 16, Part 1.